So the first thing, well, the next thing I just want to say is, we've kind of been touching on it, but there are a few ways that we can just modify that exercise to build this perfect rep. And the few things that we're thinking of is, first of all, tempo. Like, what is the tempo of this exercise? Like, I'm not even talking about like, there used to be this like super slow tempo kind of cult with exercise. It's like we want to have like 8-second eccentrics and 8-second concentrics, and like they're just purely trying to maximize the amount of time under tension. And that's not, like, there's some truth to it, but it's like usually that sacrifices the amount of load that we're using, and as a result of that, you're not actually maximizing tension on the muscles, right? So there has to be a bit of a give and take. However, we want to control tempo because tempo is one way that we can standardize technique, right? But it also allows us to standardize control. Like, you're actually controlling that movement. It's not a case of you're just using momentum. And again, it could be the case that you're prescribing a tempo that is to use momentum. Like, again, you're a power lifter and you're like, okay, it's going to be controlled eccentric, but as soon as you get to depth, we're just fucking changing direction. Boom, let's go, And like, you're trying to maximize that amount of, elastic recoil in the joints and whatever else, And so tempo is the first thing that we're kind of manipulating, and we're manipulating that for increases ideally in tension in different points of the movement, perhaps, or to minimize the amount of momentum being used, or potentially, again, to maximize it. Again, comes back to what the goal is, right? So we need to think about tempo. There are other reasons why we would use tempo, in terms of it actually allows you to change the forces at play in that exercise. And again, one of those ones, like we said, the bench press. This is why in competitive, powerlifting, they pause at the chest, because it actually does significantly change the forces at play. So that is something to be aware of. And, discussing tempo is a much larger discussion, and it's very nuanced in terms of, as I said, like, there's the super slow crowd. There's also the, tempo doesn't fucking matter crowd. And then there's also, like, obviously some truth to both sides. But what are your thoughts there, Gary, on just tempo? Because if we're talking about building the perfect rep, it's not just a case of, okay, I'll just do the reps and I've picked a better exercise. I've done all the other stuff that we've previously talked about. Like, you have to specify like what that rep should look like.
Yeah. So from my perspective, like, tempo always matters, because the only way it can't matter is if there's no difference in properties of the load, regardless of how fast it drops, which is clearly in violation of physics. Go ahead.
Basically, like, it's like, the dimensions of this world. It's like we have 3 dimensions, and a fourth one is time, so you can't just ignore it. That's like saying, like, I always use the example when you try to explain like the space-time continuum, which sounds like you're like, oh, I'm real fucking smart, but it's basically just like anyone. It's really intuitive. Like, I can't just say to you, oh, meet me at, I don't know, O'Connell Street, O'Connell Bridge or whatever, I can't just say that. Like, that's meaningless without a time dimension. I'm like, okay, meet me at O'Connell's Bridge on Saturday at 2 p.m. You need to have that time dimension, right? It needs to be specified. So if we are moving our body through space and time, which is what exercise is, we need to specify both of those things. We need to be like, okay, this is how it should look. This is how you are moving through the 3 dimensions. And this is the time aspect of it as well. Let's layer that on top.
Yeah. And I mean, like, it's something that you learn, and I'm pretty sure, like, junior cert science in the physics section, that, like, if you drop something faster, versus just placing it down. And to be honest, you learn that as a kid, if you drop an egg from 1 centimeter onto the floor, it might crack, it might not break. But if I drop it from a meter, like, very clearly there's a big difference there, because it's accelerating. Or if you smash it down versus if you just place it down, there's differences in the property. It's not just about the mass of the egg. Okay. And it's very similar when it comes to resistance training, because if I'm squatting 100 kilos and, lower the weight in 4 seconds, then I've already done more muscular work to get down to the bottom, because I've actually, decelerated the load or stopped it from accelerating further. So it's slower when it gets to the bottom point. And as a result, if you were to look at like a graph of what would happen to the load in terms of the forces you're dealing with, if you drop really quickly, there's going to be a big spike at the bottom. Whereas if you drop slowly, it might be a slight spike as you're changing direction, but very little. And you do feel that yourself, where, if you come down on a bench press really slowly, the change of direction feels less abrupt. It might still be really challenging from a muscular perspective, but you don't get that same experience where you'll see people in the gym dropping weight onto their chest. They get it up 3 inches where the bounce took them to, and then they just fail there. And you're wondering, you're like, God, they look like they were moving it really quickly. How did they just fail? And it was because it wasn't.
Hear people going like, oh, I have a sticking point at this point. And it's like,
Yeah,
no, that's not a sticking point. That's
the part where you have to work. Yeah, it's the part where the bounce won't take you through anymore. So look, tempo always matters. That's the first thing. It always matters. It's just a question to what degree. And this ultimately comes back to the specific context. So for example, I work with a lot of people in pain, and very often what I'll do is use specific tempos to reduce the load at different points in the range of motion. So for example, if someone has patellofemoral pain or patellar tendinopathy, so some sort of knee pain, what I'm typically going to be looking for is slower tempo on any quad exercises that we're doing, because I don't want that abrupt spike in forces at the bottom where they might be in a little bit more of a vulnerable position. It also gives them a psychological boost because they feel like, okay, more in control at every point in that position. You see that again very often in squatting, for example, where people will say, oh God, I felt like I had it, but I just couldn't go through it. Where they get to the bottom of the squat, they bounce and then they bail. They let the weight go. They weren't in control. So that's another thing that's important there. And then, of course, from just a basic training perspective, putting the rehab and pain populations aside, you'll know yourself where the part of the rep that is most challenging or that you would want to skip is. For pressing exercises, it's typically at the bottom. People try to avoid that, whether that be through changing their body position, raising one shoulder up, bouncing off the chest, etc. That's always the point where people are going to use some sort of kind of jerking movement. On a bicep curl, it's typically at the bottom. They get that weight going and then they can kind of lean back and get it up. Whereas if you start really slow from the bottom of the rep, now you have to work throughout, and it's far, far more challenging. On a chin up, for example, it's typically it's both the top and the bottom really, but any sort of pull down exercise, you'll find someone gets it to the point where maybe it comes to their eyeballs, and then they kind of just like pigeon poke their head over the top of the bar for the rest of the reps. They didn't really do anything else. They kind of just poke their way up. So they're the parts of the rep that people typically rush. And you'll analyze that in your own training. Ask yourself, what part of the rep do I normally kind of rush or jerk, or I try to avoid it? And that's typically the point where I would try to focus on slowing down the tempo a bit more, especially early on when I'm trying to get someone to grips with feeling their muscles work at all points in the rep. So if it's a lat pull down, if I can get them to really focus on that bottom position and get down there nice and slowly and pause holding position, they're going to feel their lats absolutely light up in that position. Whereas they may never have felt that if when it typically gets to their eyeballs or their forehead, they just kind of throw the head over or change their body position.
Yeah, 100%. And this is also goes back to the discussion we had in the previous podcast about like exercise selection and execution, because like you might be choosing an exercise like a chin up. You might actually just be like, right, I actually want to stop at that point. I don't want to actually get into this. I'm not going to use the chin up to get into this shortened range lat position. I'm going to use it for something else, and you're going to use a different exercise. Like maybe you're like, oh, I'm going to actually use this lat pull down here to maximize this kind of shorter position than I get into in a lat or in a chin up, So we have to have that discussion, but either way, it has to be informed. It has to be, the goal has to be almost explicitly stated, where it's like, oh, I'm actually using this exercise for X, So as you said, tempo has to be controlled. At least it has to be, standardized. Control has to be controlled. And we have to basically know why we are doing this exercise in this manner, because oftentimes you'll see people, and we see this a lot in coaching, in terms of we'll say to do an exercise and someone will do it the way that they've always done it. And we can be like, oh, actually, the reason you've gotten the results that you've gotten up until this point with this exercise is because of XYZ. It's like you are doing it, you're going through the motions at this point where you should be controlling it. You're just kind of like using a bit more momentum here. And I was like, okay, let's actually, change things up. Like I had a client relatively recently where he had been doing all these exercises that we had prescribed for him for his chest and stuff. Like he'd been doing them previously, but once we actually started coaching, I was like, look, you need to relearn this technique. You need to completely like strip this back. And we stayed at the same weight the incline bench was the one that was really getting him. It's like, we need to stay at the same weight I think it was actually the bench press as well. I was like, we need to just stay at the same weight, standardized technique. You're not actually controlling this bottom position. You're able for a much heavier weight, if we were to use a load of momentum, but you're not in control. This is just going to be limited by momentum at some stage, or potentially shoulder pain or potentially other pain somewhere else, right? So like we actually just need to strip it all back, stay at a certain weight until we are very confident that you are in control throughout this movement, that you are in control of that weight from the top of the position to the bottom of the position, and that you're actually doing the muscular work that we want. So that was something that we had to kind of like strip back and really control for that individual. And that is something that a lot of people find themselves having to do. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of people only start thinking about that once they're like, well, I've got shit results so far, or I'm not getting results at all, or they're like, oh, I'm fucking in pain, or I have injury now. It's like this. Ideally, we want to start with this, excuse me, we want to start with this discussion and this thought process rather than ending with it, So look, I think that makes sense for most people. The fundamental unit, it needs to be thought of, right? Because all training is multiple reps.